They called it a trial. The elders gave it a proper name, wrapped it in the language of the old border customs, lit torches along the riverbank as if ceremony made it something other than what it was. 17 people watched. The river was black with early frost, and they held her at the edge of it the way men hold something they are glad to be rid of. She did not scream. She did not beg. She only looked at Hallen, the elder who had led the chant, and she let her eyes say what her mouth refused to. Then, they let go. She went under. The cold was not like cold. It was a country, vast and immediate, and it had no interest in her. The current took her the way rivers take all things, without preference, without cruelty, without the kindness of a quick end. She was carried south, past the iron posts that mark the border of the northern king's territory, past the frozen sedge grass and the dark pines bending over the water, until the river grew shallow over gravel and set her down on a foreign bank. The northern king found her there at first light. And what happened in the days that followed would not be recorded in the border registers until years later, when the woman who had been thrown into a river as a witch sat at the northern king's side and wrote the account herself. That is not where the story ends. It is where it begins. The year of the crooked winter was the 11th year of Aldrich's rule over the northern reaches, and by the accounting of those who kept such things, it was the coldest autumn in 40 years. Ice formed on the Veld River a full month before the solstice. Sheep died in their pens overnight. The border villages, those thin clusters of human and wolf families strung along the southern edge of the king's territory, like beads on a fraying cord, had been under-provisioned since summer and were growing desperate in the particular way that desperate people have always found most useful, and they had found it by turning on whoever among them seemed least likely to fight back. In the village of Breck, that person was Maren. She was 25 years old, and she had lived at Breck's Edge for 7 years, since the morning Elder Hallen had hanged her mother from the oak at the center of the square and called it justice. Her mother had been a healer. Maren had watched them call her a witch for it. She had learned, watching, what it cost a woman to be useful to people who feared useful women, and she had spent the years since walking the narrow line she believed would keep her safe. Tend the sick quietly, ask nothing, give no cause for notice, speak only when spoken to, keep her hands always in view. She had known, in the way one knows a thing without allowing oneself to think it plainly, that it would not be enough. But she had not let herself think it plainly. What she had not seen coming was the ledgers. She had been in Hallen's storeroom in early autumn, delivering a remedy for his daughter's cough, and the register had been open on his table. She had not meant to read it, but numbers had a way of arranging themselves in front of her whether she invited them or not, and what she saw in those columns had made the air go out of her lungs. The tithe he reported to the king's steward was less than half of what the village actually produced. The difference went to Hallen's private ledger, noted in a different ink, in a smaller hand. 4 years of it. She had said nothing. She had gone home and said nothing for 2 months. But Hallen had seen her see it, and by the time the first Frost trial was announced, the charges of witchcraft had already been written. 17 witnesses came to the river at dawn. The bank was iron hard with frost. Maren had walked there herself because they had offered to drag her, and she thought it would be worse to be dragged. She stood at the edge of the black water and listened to Hallen lead the chant, and looked at the faces around her, some of them the faces of people whose children she had healed, and she understood that this was how it had always been going to end. She did not fight when they pushed her. If you have ever wondered what it feels like to know that a current has no intention of killing you even when a village does, stay with this story, because what happens next is not what Hallen planned. The river carried her south. The cold pressed in from every side, but the current held her, nudged her over submerged rocks, turned her face up twice when it might have gone under. By the time the water grew shallow enough to matter, her hands were blue and her thoughts were very small and far away. She did not know she had crossed the border. She did not know where she was. She lay on the gravel bank and breathed, which was the only task left to her. And she did not manage anything else before the light went gray and then went away. The man who found her was not what she expected when she opened her eyes and found anything at all. Aldrich of the northern reaches was 32 years old and had not come to the river looking for anyone. He came because Wren, one of his border guards, had crossed his path at dawn with an expression that said something had been found that required a king rather than a guard to manage. He had not expected a woman. He had not expected her to be alive. And he had not expected the thing that happened when he crouched beside her and lifted her from the gravel. Some animal hitch in him, some deep internal machinery that had been silent for 9 months, suddenly lurching, straining toward her like a compass needle slammed toward north, and then going dark again, cut off, leaving behind only the echo of what it had reached for and the particular desolation of a man who had almost felt something. He said nothing about it. He told Wren to ride ahead. He carried her himself. She was not heavy. He noticed this in the abstract, detached way one notices physical facts when they are trying not to notice something else. She was small in his arms and cold in the way that spoke not of ordinary winter cold, but of something that had gotten all the way in, past skin and wool and the ordinary defenses of a living body. Her hair was dark and wet and plastered against her face, and she was breathing. He could feel that. Her chest moving against his forearm, slow and shallow but present. He did not look at her face more than once. He looked at the path instead, the frost-hard ground between the river and the keep's gates, and he concentrated on that, and on not thinking about the thing that had happened in the first moment. The lurch of something he had been carrying in silence for 9 months, suddenly trying to say something, and then going quiet again, cut off in the way it had been cut off every time, and the desolation of the silence afterward was something he had learned to keep walking through, and he kept walking through it now. He had not carried anyone in a long time. He had not held anything with that particular quality of deliberateness, of careful and responsible force, that carrying required. He noticed this too. He filed it alongside the other things he was not thinking about. Petra, who kept the king's storerooms and had no high opinion of men in general and kings in particular, was the one who took Moran from Aldrich's arms at the keep door. She was a broad woman with gray-streaked hair and the manner of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the state in which people arrived. She looked at the frozen, half-drowned young woman and then at the king, and then back at the young woman, and said, "She'll need the south room. There's a fire already set." Aldrich said, "See that she has everything she needs." Petra said, "I know what she needs." She said it in a tone that suggested the king need not further involve himself, and somehow he didn't, which was the first unusual thing. Maren came back to herself over the course of a day and a half. First as cold, then as warmth, then as the smell of wood smoke and clean wool, then as Petra's matter-of-fact hands pressing a hot compress to the back of her neck. "Where am I?" she said, which was not quite a question. "Northern Keep," Petra said. "South room. Don't sit up yet." "Is Hallen here?" "Not yet," Petra said, which told Maren everything she needed to know about what would happen next. Hallen arrived 2 days later, with 2 of the border village's wolf men and a written demand. He was shown to the king's receiving hall in the way that people are shown somewhere when the person showing them has been instructed to convey by demeanor rather than words that they are not expected. He stood in the center of the hall's cold stone floor and presented the demand with the confidence of a man who had never had a demand refused, and he looked up at Aldrich on the dais and he said, in a voice calibrated to carry, "The witch girl, your lordship, a poisoner and a fraud. She belongs to our village's reckoning, and we've come to bring her home." Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. He said, I have read your demand. He said nothing else for long enough that Hallin's confidence began to shift its weight from one foot to the other. Then he said, Pack law holds that any person who crosses the border into the northern reaches is subject to northern jurisdiction for so long as they remain. Your demand is noted. You are free to rest here while I consider it. He rose before Hallin could answer, and was through the side door before the elder's mouth had finished opening. In the corridor beyond, Chanted, the king's second-in-command, came alongside him in the corridor. He said nothing. After a moment, Aldrich said, Keep Hallin away from the south wing. Cade said, Yes, my lord. He did not ask why. He had learned, in 11 years of service, that the king's reasons were usually sufficient, and the king's silences were usually better read than questioned. Marin was well enough to move through the keep by the third day. She moved carefully, the way she always moved in unfamiliar places, keeping to the walls, mapping the exits out of long habit. She had been given clothes, plain wool in the keep's colors, and she wore them with the practical gratitude of someone who understands that resources are resources regardless of their source. She was trying to see as much as she could before they sent her back, or before whatever came next revealed itself. What she saw by the end of the third day was that the king was ill, and that no one in the keep appeared to know it. Not ill in the way a man with a fever was ill. Ill in the way a wolf was ill when something had been done to his wolf self that his human self was being required to carry alone. She had seen it once before, in a pack wolf from a neighboring settlement who had passed through Breck 3 years ago. He had had the same quality of controlled exhaustion, the same slight flattening of his reactions, as if something that should have been loud in him was receiving no answer. That man had died within the month. She thought about the silver ash that grew along the southern banks of the Veld. She thought about chalkroot. She had watched him over those 3 days with the same quality of attention she gave to everything she was trying to understand. The same patient accumulation of small details she had learned would eventually add up to something true. She watched the way he held his cup without his hand fully closing around it, as if the grip was slightly less reliable than it should have been. She watched the way he paused at the top of the stairs each morning before descending, a pause too brief to notice unless you were already looking for it. She watched how the guards moved around him, not with the ordinary attentiveness of men around their king, but with something more careful, more compensating, the way men move around a fire that is not as hot as it was, and they do not know why. She watched him look at Hallin in the hall when Hallin arrived, and she watched the absence, the place where something should have been, some quality of territorial warning that a wolf king should have produced simply by being in the same room as a threat to something he considered his, and she saw that it was not there, not suppressed, not contained, gone. The wolf was not holding himself back. The wolf was not answering. She had not told Cade any of this. She had not told Petra. She was not sure yet whether the diagnosis was right, and she had learned young that there were things you did not say aloud until you were certain, because uncertain words, in villages like Breck, had a way of being remembered without their uncertainty attached. She did not say any of this aloud. She went to find Cade. The king's herb store, she said, and the storeroom. I need to look at what you have. Cade looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the question warranted. He said, What for? Because I think I can help, she said, and because if I'm wrong, I will be able to say so before I do anything. She paused. Hallin called me a poisoner. I want you to know that I understand what you're weighing. Cade said nothing for long enough that she was sure he would refuse. Then he said, I'll show you the stores. He watched her go through every shelf without commenting. When she asked for rendered wolf fat, there was a pause, and then he sent someone to find it. The chalk root was in the medicinal stores, bundled and dried. The other thing she needed she extracted by scraping the inner bark of the silver ash log that sat unlit in the secondary hearth, a log that she had seen and noted and said nothing about when she first walked through the hall. When she had finished gathering everything, she took it all to the small room they had given her, and she began. 3 nights. That was what the rendering required. 3 nights of slow heat and careful timing, the kind of work that her mother had taught her to do in the dark because there had always been someone who would see it and call it something it was not. She did it in the dark again now, by the small window that let in just enough cold moonlight to work by. The first night she rendered the chalk root, working it through a piece of clean linen folded twice, watching the color come through pale and greenish-gray into the earthenware bowl she had borrowed from the kitchen store. Her hands knew this work. They had been doing it since she was 11 years old, at her mother's side, learning which plants wanted slow heat and which wanted quick, which combinations would cancel each other, and which would bind into something with more force than either alone. Her mother had told her once that remedies were not magical in the way people feared. They were patient, she said. They did not care who used them. They simply did what their nature required. The second night she worked the silver ash bark into the wolf fat, which was the part that carried the binding across the blood rather than sitting on the surface of it. She kept the heat low and even. She had only the small oil lamp she'd found in the window ledge, and she kept the flame down, because light was the thing she could not explain if anyone walked past her door. Twice she heard the guard's footsteps on the corridor stone, and she stilled her hands until the sound passed. She was not afraid of being caught doing something harmful. She was afraid of being caught doing something true, which was the older fear, the one she had learned first. On the third morning she brought the finished poultice to the king's study in a small clay bowl. He was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did not change, which she had come to understand was the version of surprise he permitted himself. She set the bowl on the corner of his desk and stepped back. She said, "It's a binding poultice for ash blight. 3 applications over a week and your wolf will come back. I can't tell you how you were exposed. That's your question to answer." She paused. "I know what it looks like when a wolf is being strangled from inside. I've seen it once. I didn't want to watch it happen again." He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. The quality of his attention was different from other men's attention, denser somehow, and she found it difficult not to look away from it. He said, "And if it's not what you say it is?" She said, "Then you're no worse off than you are now." She let him weigh it. "You don't trust me. You have no reason to. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to consider whether a woman who wanted to do you harm would have handed it to you in a clay bowl in daylight." Something in his face shifted. Just barely. He picked up the bowl. Cade saw him apply the first treatment that evening. He said nothing to Aldrich about it. He said nothing to Marin either. But the next morning he came to find her in the keep's small scriptorium, where she had been sitting with the old border registers in her lap, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "He hasn't entered that room in 9 years, since before the blight." He paused. "I thought you should know." She looked up. She said, "He came here?" "He stood in the doorway," Kay had said. "For a while." She had not known. She had been deep in the registers, in the column of numbers, and the doorway had been behind her, and she had not heard him. She thought about what it meant that he had stood there and not spoken, that he had looked at her and then gone away, and she thought about what Cade was trying to tell her, and she set the thought down somewhere she was not ready to examine. Later, she would understand that Cade had been trying to do something specific in telling her. He had been trying to give her information she needed to make a particular decision, in the way loyal men sometimes operate when they are not permitted to say directly what they believe. She did not understand this at the time. She understood only that she had been sitting in a room reading registers, and a king had stood in the doorway in silence and gone away, and that this was both a fact and something more than a fact, and that she could not decide what to do with the more than fact part. She went back to the registers. She kept reading. The columns were soothing in the way that numbers were always soothing to her, because they could not be anything other than what they were. A number was not kind or cruel. It did not have a motive. It only told you what had happened and how much of it. And whether you were looking at the columns Hallen had kept honestly or the columns he had kept for himself, the number told you the truth with equal dispassion. She found 3 more discrepancies she had not found before. She wrote them down. If you've ever sat with something you cannot yet name and tried to make yourself useful to keep from thinking about it, you know what those hours were like for Maren. Stay with her now, because the hours before Vorn arrived were the last quiet ones she would have. On the 7th day after her arrival, Elder Vorn came from the Pack Council. Vorn was a tall man, gray-haired, with the polished, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to occupying rooms until other people felt the need to justify their presence in them. He came with 4 council wolves and a document sealed with the council's iron mark. He arrived at midday and he asked for the Great Hall, and Aldrich gave him the hall, because the hall was the appropriate place to hear council business, and refusing would be a different kind of error. The hall filled. The keep's wolves came in from their posts and their duties because a council visit required witnesses, and because the pack's instinct about what was happening in their own hall brought them in without instruction. Cade was positioned at the far side of the dais, standing rather than seated, which meant he was ready to move. 2 of the keep's senior wolves stood behind Aldrich's chair. They were not ceremonial positions. They were practical ones. Maren stood at the back of the hall near the pillar. She had not been told to leave, and she had not left. She had understood when she dressed that morning that whatever happened next would happen in this hall, and she had decided that she would rather see it coming. She watched Vorn move through the assembly with the ease of a man doing something he had done many times, placing himself where he wanted to be, letting the room arrange itself around him. And she thought about the kind of confidence that required, and the kind of history that produced it. He had never had a room refuse him. She watched Aldrich's face as Vorn approached the table. She had become, over 9 days, quite skilled at reading Aldrich's face. She had done it out of necessity at first, because his face was the weather she was living in, and a woman who has spent 7 years gauging whether a room was safe to be in learns to read faces the way sailors learn to read sky. Now she did it because she could, and because what she read there was never quite what she expected. He was not afraid of Vorn. That much was clear. He was doing something colder than afraid, which was calculating. Vorn presented the document with the careful ceremony of a man who believes ceremony is a form of force. He said, "The Council Enforcement Bond, my Lord King, issued under Pack law and binding on all northern territories. The woman Maren of Breck was convicted of witchcraft under the border customs of her village, and her execution is required before the next new moon. The village elder's authority in this matter has been confirmed by the council." He placed the document on the table between them. He did not look at Maren. Hallen was in the hall too. He looked at her. He said, in the voice he had used on the riverbank, in the voice he had used in the square when they hanged her mother, and he said it with the same satisfaction. "The witch dies at dawn. The council has spoken." Aldrich looked at the document. His face held the quality of stone. He said, "The bond is noted." He said nothing else. Vorn said, "It requires your acknowledgement, my lord." A long silence moved through the hall. Maren kept her eyes on Aldrich. She watched his jaw tighten. She watched the calculation move behind his eyes, the weight of 11 years of understanding exactly what the Pack Council could and could not be pushed, and she knew before he lifted his pen what it would mean that he lifted it. He acknowledged the bond. The hall exhaled. Vorn picked up the document and folded it with precise fingers, and said that the prisoner would be held in the keep's south room until dawn. He did not call her the prisoner to her face. He did not look at her at all. Maren stood at the back of the hall and she let herself look at Aldrich one more time. She looked at him the way she had looked at everything since she was a child, and learned that looking carefully was one of the things she had that people could not take. He had not looked at her while he signed. She understood why. A man who looked at the person he was surrendering looked like a man uncertain of the surrender, and uncertainty was what Vorn had come here to create, and Aldrich had spent 20 minutes refusing to give him. The not looking was the only way he had, in that room, with those witnesses, of denying Vorn the advantage. She understood this. It did not make it easier to understand. She watched the hall empty. She watched Hallen leave with the satisfaction of a man who had come for something and was leaving with it. And she watched Caed move to block him from taking anything more than that satisfaction, a small positioning of bodies that looked incidental and was not. She watched Vorn step through the side door with his document folded against his chest. She watched Aldrich stand at the head of the table long after the others had filed out, looking at the place where his pen had touched the paper, with an expression she had no adequate name for. Then he left. The hall was empty. The fire in the iron grate went on burning, indifferent to what had just happened in front of it. Caed came to her room after. He stood in the doorway and he said, "I'm sorry." He said it plainly, without ornament, the way men say things they mean when they have run out of the kind of words that make difficult things feel manageable. Maren nodded. She said, "I know." He left. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark keep, and she thought very carefully about what she knew and what she had, and what could still be done. She had her memory. She had 4 years of Hallen's false ledger columns memorized the way she had memorized everything in her life that she thought might someday need to matter. She found Petra an hour before midnight. Petra was in the storeroom, as she generally was, because storerooms were places where things needed to be done, regardless of what was happening in the halls. Maren told her what she was going to do in the morning. She told her what she needed Petra to carry. Petra listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Maren had come to understand about her in the past week. When Maren had finished, Petra said, "You'll get one chance to say it all." "I know." "Say it fast," Petra said. "They'll try to stop you." She took the folded pages that Maren pressed into her hands. She looked at them for a moment. She said, "Your mother would have done the same thing." Maren didn't answer. She went back to her room and she did not sleep, and she watched the window go from black to gray to the dull pewter of a northern dawn without the sun making any commitment about appearing. She thought about her mother during those hours. Not in the way she usually thought about her, which was a quick flinching away, like touching something that had been in a fire. She thought about her more directly, with the deliberateness of someone who has run out of softer options. Her mother had been 34 years old when they hanged her. She had been a healer and a careful woman, and she had never, as far as Maren could determine, done anything to deserve what was done to her, and none of that had mattered at all. Usefulness had not protected her. Carefulness had not. Being quiet and giving no cause for notice had not. The village had decided what she was, and the deciding was the thing that killed her, not anything she had actually done. Maren had spent 7 years trying to learn from that. She had tried to be quieter. She had tried to be less useful, or at least less visibly useful, or at least useful in ways the village could accept, without having to think about what she was using to be useful with. She had kept her eyes down. She had walked carefully. She had never let anyone see her read, because reading was one of the things they had called her mother for, and she had never let anyone know she had memorized Hallen's ledgers, because that was a kind of reading too, the kind that most endangered people who could do it. And here she was, in the Northern King's Keep, sentenced to die at dawn for being her mother's daughter. She thought about that, about method and its opposite. She had spent 7 years being careful. She had one morning left. She would spend it the way her mother had spent 34 years, which was being exactly what she was, and letting the world decide what to do with that. She watched the window. She waited for enough light to walk by. When the light was gray enough, she rose. She put on her shoes. She walked downstairs to the great hall. There were 22 wolves in the hall at that hour, Vorn's 4, Hallen and his 2, and the rest of the keep's own pack, roused by instinct or by word, filling the benches and the standing spaces along the walls. Maren walked to the center of the room, and she stood there, in the plain wool dress in the keep's colors, and she waited until enough of the hall was looking at her to make speaking worthwhile. Vorn said, "Take her outside." He said it to no one in particular, in the tone of a man who trusts that words said in the right voice require no specific enforcement. Maren said, "In the 4th year of the crooked winter, the border tithe from the village of Breck was recorded to the crown at 800 weight of grain, 40 measures of salt fish, and 63 hides." Her voice was even. She had practiced evenness. The actual production of the village was 1,060 weight of grain, 112 measures of salt fish, and 141 hides. The hall was very quiet. "In the 5th year," she said, "the recorded tithe was 920 weight of grain." Hallen crossed the floor toward her. Cade stepped between them from the wall, without being told, without looking at Hallen, without any particular expression. Hallen stopped. "In the 6th year," Maren said. She got through all 4 years. Her voice did not shake. The numbers lay in the hall like stones, solid and unignorable, and when she finished, she looked at Vorn, who was looking at Hallen, and she watched the calculation Vorn was making arrive at its conclusion, and watched his expression shift in the way that cold and political men's expressions shift when the ground has moved and they are deciding whether to pretend it has not. Then the hall's iron doors opened. It was not loud. She had imagined, sometimes, what the sound of a gate shattering would be. It was not that. It was the sound of heavy wood moving on its hinges because the force behind it made resistance a question the door briefly considered, and then answered honestly. Both doors swung wide. Cold morning air came in, and with it the light off the northern fields, and in the light, framed in the doorway, was Aldrich. She had seen him each day for 7 days. She had seen him at his desk, at the table, on the dais. She had looked at him carefully because looking carefully was how she had always survived. But she had not seen this. The quality of the air in the hall changed when he crossed the threshold. Not a visible thing, not a sound or a light, but a pressure, a weight of attention that the room itself seemed to produce, and the wolves nearest the door went to their knees without appearing to decide to. He crossed the room. He walked the way men walk when they are not performing movement but simply moving, and the space opened ahead of him without effort. He stopped in front of her. She looked up. 9 years of wolf silence and 9 months of ash blight had ended in a week, and what she was looking at now was the northern king without the muffling, without the suppression, without the long gray quiet of a man carrying his wolf in his arms because something had killed its ability to walk. He looked at her for a moment that was very still. Then he took her wrist, not roughly, not gently, with the careful precision of a man who knows exactly how much force he is using and has made a choice about it. He turned, and she turned with him, and they were both facing the hall, and the 42 wolves left standing were looking at them. He went to one knee. The sound of it. The king of the northern reaches going to one knee on the cold stone floor of his own hall was the sound of something enormous and unhurried, settling into a position it had chosen. The hall held its breath. Maren was looking at the top of his dark head, and she was not breathing either. And in the space of that breathlessness, something finished falling into place that had been falling for 7 days, for 9 years, for the length of time it takes a river to carry something south and set it down where it was always meant to arrive. He said in a voice that did not require volume, "She is mine. She has always been mine." The bond document in Vorn's hand turned to ash. It did not burn. It did not smoke. It simply became what all false things eventually become, and the gray powder that had been the council's seal drifted to the floor and settled there. Vorn looked at his empty hands. He looked at Aldrich. He said nothing, because there was nothing in the architecture of his certainties that had a room prepared for this. Cade bound Hallin's wrists before Hallin finished understanding what was happening. Two of the keep's wolves moved to Vorn. The 4 council wolves had gone to their knees like the rest. Petra appeared at the hall's side entrance, the pages folded in her hands, her face composed in the way of someone who has been waiting for an accounting a very long time and is satisfied to have lived to see it. The border register. Hallin's 4 years of false entries. Vorn's seal on the enforcement bond that had been built on a corrupt alliance rather than any actual law. All of it laid open in a hall that had the same stone floor, the same iron rafters, the same assembly of witnesses that had watched Aldrich acknowledge the bond the night before. The same room that had heard "The witch dies at dawn" heard instead the sound of a king on his knees and the silence of a false document ceasing to exist. Marin looked down at Aldrich. He raised his head. His eyes were the color she had not let herself look at directly until now. She thought about the river. She thought about the gravel bank at dawn and the cold and the feeling of having been set down somewhere by a force that had no preference in the matter and being uncertain, in those first dark minutes, whether she was supposed to survive it. She thought about chalk root and 3 nights of careful heat and a clay bowl placed on a desk corner and a doorway she had not known anyone was standing in. She said, quietly enough that only he heard it, "You could have stood up." He said, "No." She let herself understand what that meant, what it cost, what it could not be unmade. She put her hand on his shoulder and he rose. 7 years Marin had served a village that hanged her mother and threw her in a river. 9 years Aldrich had stood mateless, wolf-silenced, blighted by a poison placed by the man who had just watched his authority dissolve into ash. On the morning after the first frost trial, with frost still hard on the fields and the Veld River audible through the keep's stone walls, 42 witnesses knelt in the northern King's Hall and rose again, as people who had seen the ground of the world move and could not afterward claim they had not. Hallin and Vorn were taken north, to the council's own judgment, with the ledger evidence carried ahead of them and Aldrich's testimony sealed and sent that same day. The border tithe was reviewed. The false balance was corrected. The village of Breck received a new register. Petra brought the pages back to Marin herself 3 days later, because she was Petra, and she had carried them this far, and she thought she had earned the delivery. She stood in the doorway of what had been the south room, what was now simply Marin's room, and would be something else again within the month, and she put the pages on the table and said, "Done." Marin said, "Yes." Petra looked at her for a moment. She said, "You know there's a great deal of work ahead." "I know. The border villages need someone who knows what's been happening to them." "I know." Petra's expression did something that was not quite a smile, but was in the vicinity of one. She went back to her storeroom, where there was always something that needed doing. The border registers were returned to the scriptorium. Marin went through them in the weeks that followed, correcting what could be corrected, noting what could not. Aldrich came to the doorway sometimes. Sometimes he came inside. The room had a cold, good light in the mornings, the kind that comes off winter fields and doesn't lie about what it illuminates. And it fell across the open registers and across his hands when he set them on the table's edge, and once, across their joined hands, his scarred fingers closed over hers while she slept, sitting up in the chair with the last entry half read. She woke to his hand on hers, the river sound through the walls, the register open to a page she had already memorized. She did not need the numbers anymore. She left her hand where it was,